Welcome to the second annual lecture of the Independent Transport Commission. Baroness, Lords, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to, as I say, to Rothschild's and the second annual lecture. I'm Simon Linnett. I'm a Vice Chairman at Rothschild's and Chairman of the ITC. And it is with great regret that I have to announce a slight change to the programme that I see that some of you opening in front of you, in that Lord Freeman, who was going to follow me, has had to absent himself, and he's got a health condition. And Alan Baxter, his great friend, will step in admirably to his shoes. Just by way of introduction to the ITC and this evening, the ITC is a research-based think tank covering and initiating debate around the whole of transport and land planning. And in that, encompassing all those aspects, we are, as we believe, unique in the country. We're very pleased to welcome here, particularly our supporters, and even more particularly those people who we hope will become supporters, without whom none of our work could proceed. We are totally independent of any government money, and it's only through general sponsorship at the core level, not on individual projects, that allows us to make the contribution that we do make, I think, to the national debate. Most of what we do at the ITC is to look at specific transport areas. Hopefully we look at them unconventionally, but we still probably in most cases look at them with a conventional derived demand perspective. In other words, that transport is a derived demand of economic and human activity. So that covers 5 areas that we're operating in: aviation strategy, how we pay for roads, analysing the fundamental changes that are taking place in the use of car and rail, freight strategy, and high speed too. We hope we punch above our weight because we are lean and mean, so it's important we do. And in the last year, we've made clearly informed commentators, particularly in aviation. We've been referenced repeatedly in core publications by the department on HS2 and roads, and we're working now with government in 2 areas to investigate potential changes in the way they look forward, which is very pleasing for us, and I hope we're making a contribution to those debates. But tonight is slightly different because we're addressing in this, our second annual lecture, in many ways a much, much more difficult subject, which is why we as humans want to travel. And we would contend, and we'll have a debate after 2 speakers who will illuminate this subject, it's not just merely to get from A to B. Why have we on average travelled for an hour a day for the last 400 years? Why do we pace our offices when we're deep in thought? Why do we express our religion in pilgrimage? What is there about movement that is at the core of our soul? So I'm keen that you elevate your minds from the day-to-day, from transport planning, from timetabling, or whatever you've been doing before you came here, and try and get into the essential motivation of travel. And maybe that will inform those of you that are in the profession, what is going on in maybe the minds of the people that you're serving, beyond the sheer need to get from A to B. In a moment or two, Alan will introduce the subject more generally before our 2 speakers will take over. But before might I put this annual lecture in context? This project hopefully will spawn a book, probably in the middle of next year. We're talking to a significant publisher, I think, who's here today, I'm not quite sure. We've talked to the BBC about running a documentary series on the same subject. And we also talked to Transport Catapult about the possibility of introducing a module into further education. It's invidious to single out any one party for thanks in all this, but I would have to make reference to Chris Burrett, who with Matthew has been the driver of this whole initiative, and without whom, frankly, we would only be scrabbling at the surface, and together with Bright has made this all happen. But that's for the future. For today is the opportunity to listen to 2 excellent speakers and to introduce the subject, their warm-up act, I suppose, if we were at Glastonbury. Maybe I'll pass you over to Alan. our esteemed Treasurer.
Well, thank you, Simon. I am not a comedian, so I can't do the conventional warm-up, but I thought I ought to just fill you in about how this whole subject started in the first place. And quite a few people are surprised that an organization like the ITC, which produces highly regarded studies on subjects like freight logistics, very important, and statistical changes in patterns of car and rail use and so on, we've embarked on a subject which is, in some ways, seems to be woolly, if not weird, but it is a great credit to my fellow commissioners that the ITC, when I first proposed this idea, that after some of the initial reaction of shock and horror, they took to it with great gusto and as a fundamental aspect of the whole issue of transport. And it is incredibly important. And Chris Burrett, as you've heard, has been immensely valuable in making the whole subject sing now, and it's developing really interesting ideas which are going to be of major importance in how we think about transport in the future. And the ideas first originated, in my mind, anyhow, in wondering why, this is many years ago, I often found myself at odds with my logical engineering background. And say, perhaps you do it too still, I occasionally do it, running down for sheer pleasure a grassy slope, or walking far further than I need because I want to see what's around the next corner. We all do it, but we ignore it as just a sort of oddity of human behavior. But the need to move is as fundamental to us as humans as it is to sleep. Why do we sleep? Big issues. And deprive a person of sleep, they go mad, without any doubt. Deprive a person of movement, and they shrivel in their minds and also in their bodies too. And then, except a few exceptional people, monks perhaps, have got a spiritual existence, but most of us, 99% of us, have to move to keep ourselves alive and sane and imaginative. Now, I certainly don't ever want to be locked up in a prison, so far have avoided it, or in a hospital ward or anything like that. And its movement is the prime driver, if we look at the last 250 years of the Industrial Revolution. It has been extraordinarily successful in the immense achievements of engineers and planners and architects in the construction of canals and railways, roads, airports. It's fundamental to our lives, movement. And it's a very important issue that it is working. A lot of people here have been very instrumental in the creative imagination of the things that have made us really successful as a society in movement. It's great. But the human desire for movement, it has been partly served, if you like, by this incredible technology. I don't think it's actually changed very much since before the Industrial Revolution, but it hasn't been fully satisfied by what we actually are about as transport engineers or planners. And it's very interesting to try and understand now what it is that we as humans really find successful and enjoyable and fulfilling in how we move. And I'm looking forward to hearing the two speakers tonight. And what I did myself is just I analyzed what I did in a very subjective way, why I moved. And you may find it interesting to plot out, maybe for a month or two, why you would move in your different journeys and what you get out of it too. And you may find that there are quite a few areas where it's not just the conventional, boring, practical function. You're doing other things. You're taking a walk rather than going immediately into the fastest possible transport, a slow walk, or walking just for the point of thinking something out, or taking a dog for a walk, but perhaps the dog doesn't want to go, but you do. And there are so many issues there which are to do with lack of conventional logic that we don't actually recognize, we just get on with it. And of course, there are major issues in how we are as a society. For instance, it's very pleasurable to sit on a train watching a view flick past. And it's quite nice being on the top deck of a bus sometime when you've got plenty of time, just observing people in the street and the city that is our city, we're citizens of it. And it's very, very important to actually walk, because it's only by walking in good streets that we rub shoulders with our fellow citizens, and then we have a sense of community and togetherness. So walking is a very, very key part of our lives, and I think now it's much better recognized in urban design that good streets create good societies because people walk in a very pleasurable way there. And so watching people walking in and moving or sitting in good places is always pleasurable. It's very seldom that people get bored by observing other people moving. And so your study, if you do it, you'll find that you actually do want to walk places that you wouldn't otherwise do logically. And you do want, if you like cycling, get on a bike on a country lane occasionally. It's wonderful if you can ski, just whooshing down in a sensuous way through powder snow. Movement is a joy if it's right. Just occasionally, motoring is still joyful, but very much less so. So what is very interesting that will come out of this study is perhaps an influence about how we might be more intelligent in how we plan transport in the future. There are other parallels, like with health planning, there's more awareness now that hospitals where the patient is by a window, the patient is less time in the hospital, so it's more efficient. And I sense that there are other major issues that we haven't yet really focused on in the way in which we organize transport. And of course, one of the great issues of transport is that we live in a world where it's a small world, it's getting smaller, a growing population, greater demands. There are really important issues for us to understand, not just the joy of movement, but how to arrange it in such a way that it doesn't kill off our wonderful planet. So this study by the ITC might well lead on to a much deeper understanding of why we move. And that's why I'm looking forward very much to hearing the speakers and then your ideas afterwards. Thank you.
Alan, thank you very much. So we have two speakers. They will look at this same subject from a complementary angle. We start with Charles Pasternak. Charles is a world-leading biochemist. He's a founder of the Oxford International Biomedical Centre. He's written a number of books, but probably most significantly known amongst many for Quest, The Essence of Humanity. And he's going to start us off by, through his biomedical studies, addressing the biological motivation that we have for movement, before we turn over to Stephen Bayley, who I'll introduce in a moment. Charles, thank you.
Thank you. Well, my talk is going to be very straightforward because the answer of why humans travel is actually one word, and that is curiosity. That is Aristotle, and Aristotle said, all men by nature desire to know. All men by nature desire to know. More recently, this man is Alistair Hardy, who was Professor of Zoology in Oxford in the 1960s, and he had the view that out of this process of evolution from somewhere has come the urge or love of adventure in man that can drive him to risk his life in climbing Everest or in reaching the South Pole or the moon. This was before the moon landing, actually. Is it altogether too naive to believe that this exploratory drive, this curiosity, has had its beginnings in some deep-seated part of animal behavior which is fundamental to the stream of life? Well, I believe it is. Of course, all animals are curious, and all animals have to travel for food, shelter, and water, and a mate, not so far for a mate, and we've been doing the same all the time. But there's one difference between all animals and ourselves, and that is we are able to exercise our curiosity better than any other animal. This is a dragonfly, which has some of the largest eyes you could imagine. It's not, our curiosity is not exercised because of our large eyes, nor because of our smell. That a bear has a 2,000-fold better sense of smell than we do, nor because of our hearing. A tiger, you see, there it is. You see these ears actually rotate like a radar dish, and so it can pick up sounds far better than we can. No, our nearest relative, the chimpanzee, with which we share all our genes, but on some of those genes, various mutations have occurred over the last 6 million years, which was when the common ancestor of chimpanzees and ourselves lived. And I'm going to delineate 3 crucial changes that made us able to be more curious and search more than any other creature. And the first is the arm. These are scaled to the same length, but of course a chimpanzee's arm is relatively much longer. But I want you to focus on this human thumb. The human thumb, some people say, has been at the root of all technological innovation over the last 2 million years. For example, the thumb in the hand, we can use the precision grip, whether it's to take out a kidney or tie up our shoelaces. A chimpanzee uses the power grip when he's eating a banana. The development of the hand, thumb, and the other bones in it took place because man had started walking upright. It was actually one of our predecessors, about 3-4 million years ago, a species called Australopithecus, meaning southern ape, living in the Rift Valley of East Africa. The Rift Valley stretches from Ethiopia down to Lake Malawi. And there are footprints showing that Australopithecus was already walking upright. It was an ape 3 to 4 million years ago. The first Homo species is generally thought to be Homo habilis about 2 million years ago, by which time we were using tools. So the hand is absolutely crucial. The second thing, of course, is the voice box, the larynx, and the difference is very slight, actually. A newborn child is very much like a newborn chimpanzee. It whimpers. Chimpanzees whimper. A newborn child, like a chimpanzee, can breathe and swallow at the same time. Try breathing and swallowing at the same time. We can't do it. We lose that capacity at 3-4 years of age because we develop the larynx the vocal cord is a little lower down in females, even lower in males. And that slight development, again, just a very minor genetic change, has meant that we have speech. We're the only species that has speech. I mean, I know dolphins communicate, parrots speak, but not to the extent. It's been the basis of social life, which many people now think is a characteristic of humans. And the third thing, of course, is our brain. Our brain, this is actually not on here, this is Neanderthal, which is about our size, is about 3 times bigger than that of the common precursor of ourselves and chimpanzees. 6 million years ago. And the chimpanzee brain has not changed very much. It's an extraordinary thing that actually human brains and human development generally has been much faster over the last 6 million years than that of chimpanzees. The important thing about the brain is the cortex at the top, this part here, which in a human occupies most of the brain. In other animals, other parts are predominant, as I showed you in the bears, for example. The capacity for smell is greater and enhanced, and the eye of the visual part of the dragonfly, and so on. But the brain, 3 times more neurons, that's nerve cells in our brain. You might think 3 times as many, but that has made a crucial difference. So we have about 100 billion nerve cells in our brain, same number as the stars in the Milky Way, and each of those is connected to thousands of others. So the complexity is enormous, and it is probably different in every person on the world, because it comes about willy-nilly. There doesn't seem to be any plan laying down specific neurons, and so some people happen to be born clever and others not so clever. Anyway, so as a result of that ability to exercise our curiosity, we have traveled to an enormous extent. In fact, we've traveled all over the world. So here are just some of the timelines of our travel across the entire globe, whereas our nearest relative, the chimpanzee, is largely restricted to an area here in West Africa and these areas in West and Central Africa. Chimpanzees, of course, animals, if they're curious, they will start moving out of their environment. The chimpanzee couldn't do it because humans have now destroyed the forest, and so he couldn't do it if he wanted to. And in general, animals cannot survive outside their environment. That's the difference, because we are able to make the environment adapt to us. There are occasional stories. For example, the ancestor of today's camel, about 20,000 years ago, actually it started in North America, believe it or not, camels, and they wandered, and I say to you, why does an animal go outside its range? It's curious, wants to see what's going on. Or it could be searching for food. Wandered across the Bering Straits when it was still a land bridge before the last ice age stopped, but of course in the direction opposite to the one that humans took to inhabit the Americas. And there's an example of some lions that moved out of Africa about 20,000 years ago, the same time as humans, because all humans originated in Africa, the same time as Homo sapiens, now by now Homo sapiens, was moving into Europe. And some of these lions finished up in India. Most of them became extinct, but there are a few left in a nature reserve. And Wilfred Thesiger, who was a great traveler, when he walked up Kilimanjaro, he found a dead dog. And the answer is, well, why did he go to Kilimanjaro? It was probably curious, it got there, but then he didn't know how to escape the cold and it just died. So that's the extent of travel. And one of the most prolific travelers, almost 200 years before Columbus, was curious to see whether he could reach India and China by traveling westwards instead of eastwards, because he had heard that some people thought actually the earth is round. And he thought, well, maybe he can prove it. So 200 years before, Ibn Battuta, who was a Muslim scholar living in Tangier, traveled all over the world, I think out of curiosity. Well, it is true to say that he, on his first journey, went around here, several visits to Mecca. So part of his visits were religious. He did the Hajj. But he traveled around. And his predecessor, you will immediately say to me, well, Marco Polo traveled all the way to China as well. Yeah, indeed he did. I think Marco Polo traveled largely for work purposes. He wanted to work for the Emperor of China, and he did. So he traveled out and he traveled back. But even Battuta travelled around here on one of his voyages. Then he came around here, the east coast of Africa. Then he travelled all the way around into the bottom end of Russia, around here, all the way to China. His curiosity did not only extend to travel, it also extended to the human form, particularly the female form. So, for example, while he was in the Maldives alone, he married 6 times, which is the maximum number allowed by Muslim law, and lots of others as well. And then finally he came all the way back again and went down to Africa. 70,000 miles in his life. Actually, it was most of his life. The need to travel. But there is no need to travel nowadays. You can sit in an armchair and you can travel to the moon, you can travel up Everest, you can walk along the Grand Canal, you can do everything sitting in an armchair. And yet, and you can have conferences, Skype and everything. Yet, why do the heads of big corporations, the CEOs, who lead very busy lives, spend most of the time on airplanes? I believe it is because they are visiting their staff and their competitors. They're curious to know how they react. They want to have a conversation one-to-one, even though you can do it, as I say, with modern technology. It's not the same. You cannot judge a person's reaction in quite the same way. That's why I believe many people still travel. And of course, work is one of the main reasons why people now travel. As I said, work was the reason that Marco Polo traveled such a lot. But if you can do all this, you can sit and you can watch programs here and there, and you can visually, being in Istanbul and so on, and gradually people are beginning to be couch potatoes. And I think that symptom is the same as the dumbing down that we've seen in education in this country over the last 30 years or so. Dumbing down is the opposite of curiosity, and it loses us competitiveness. And if we're not careful, we shall finish up like the lotus eaters. You will recall, let us swear an oath and keep it with an equal mind, in the hollow lotus land to live and lie reclined, on the hills like gods together, careless of mankind. That is not a prescription for competitiveness with China and the other continents. So, my conclusion is very simple. We need to continue to encourage young people to actually get out and do it, travel themselves, learn a language, go up Mount Kilimanjaro, and so on. And the best way to achieve that is undoubtedly through this organization, which can then persuade government. Thank you.
Charles, thank you very much. That last bit was completely unscripted and completely unpredictable, but very much welcome nonetheless. And thank you very much for such a clear and provoking exposition of the issues associated with our ability to pinch and our brains, etc. The next speaker is Stephen Bayley, who requires no introduction other than the one that he asked me to give for himself. International sex god, was it? Yeah, I did ask. He's a world-renowned author, broadcaster, commentator, with Terence Conran, founded effectively the Design Museum, He's written in more publications from Condé Nast to the FT than most of us have read. He's been acknowledged by many institutions from the University of Wales, or I can't name them all. And what Stephen is going to do is to take what Charles has told us about our human condition, I hope, into how this is going to mean we react with each other, with a relationship with transport, etc. So over to you, Stephen. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, good evening. It's a great pleasure to be here. It's one of the first occasions I've ever spoken when the audio-visual thing is actually working, and that's an added delight. I'm actually rather preoccupied by the idea of what the French call le monde à l'envers, the world turned upside down. I think all our assumptions about travel are probably about to be, or certainly mine are, about to be revised. I mean, several years ago, I took part in the Conservative Party conference, a debate about low-cost air travel. I mean, I don't define myself by politics, but generally speaking, I'm a sort of libertarian hedonist. That must be obvious. But I have an argument against low-cost travel, and my arguments, from the libertarian hedonist perspective, were based on the idea that about environmental concerns about increasing low-cost air travel. I don't just mean the obvious things about carbon and using up unrenewable resources, but we now know that the contrails which aeroplanes cause themselves, they create artificial cloud patterns which contribute in a way to global warming. But I'm also I'm more culturally concerned as well about how low-cost air travel actually destroys the destinations which it's meant to delight us with it. So I was actually at the Conservative Party conference, the Libertarian Hedonist, advocating self-denial, saying, no, it's marvellous perhaps that you can go to Prague for less than the price of a pizza, but maybe it's not a good idea. However, against me, and this is about the le monde à l'envers idea, was the delightful man called Simon Calder, who is the travel editor of The Independent. He's a lovely, lovely man, but and I'd say this if Simon was here now. Perhaps he is. Simon, are you? No. Simon is actually cartoon socialist. I mean, Simon actually wears sandals and socks, and he's a man. No, I'm not mocking it. He's absolutely a man of huge, old-fashioned Fabian principles. So here was me, the libertarian hedonist, saying self-denial. We must stop using low-cost travel because it's ruining the planet, destroying destinations. And Simon, the old-fashioned socialist, would say, "Oh no. It's all about consumer choice. It's about the price factor. It's about free markets." And I know you can't possibly stand in the way of this form of progress, Stephen. And, so what I'm going to say is here was Simon Calder, the advocate, the old-fashioned socialist, who's an advocate of low-cost air travel, and he was talking. He was saying, yes, we must all have unreflective self-indulgence if someone's prepared to subsidise our flight to Prague, and so we can go there for £9.90. We must do it. He was concerned with convenience. I was much more concerned with, in a rare moment of piety, I was much more concerned with principles. Of course, in front of a Conservative Party audience, where most of this was in Eastbourne or some Bournemouth or someone like that, where most of the audience had timeshares in Marbella. My argument, of course, that they all depended on EasyJet for them to extract maximum value out of their timeshare. My argument was like trying to shoot Bambi, and of course, I lost. But anyway, my point really is that I believe that the idea that travel is either a private pleasure or a business necessity is one of the great delusions of our age. And I think it's a delusion we're all, the alert amongst us are becoming acutely aware of. Henry Ford, the great motor car entrepreneur, Henry Ford said in his fabulous autobiography, which was actually written by someone else, but it was Henry Ford's autobiography, My Life and Work, 1926. He said, memorably, I had to invent the gasoline buggy in order to escape from the crushing boredom of life on a Midwest farm. And that's a magnificent idea, and of course that's still what motivates people who are prepared to sit in traffic and suffocate and the rest of it. They're still motivated, as indeed I am, we all are, by that sort of that germ of that idea which Henry Ford recognised. You have a motor car, you are free. And if you've been to the Midwest, if you've sat in a building in Detroit and you look at the vast flatness and the possibility of these distant vistas, you can understand what Ford means. Ford meant. But of course now, as we all know, the liberating machine, the gasoline buggy, which was guaranteed to take us away from boredom, has become oppressive. Today, most young people, of course, prefer a smartphone to a car. Mobility has become virtual. There was actually a large research exercise done in the United States last year which actually said that. They found that the majority of people under 30 would much rather give up their car than give up their smartphone. And incidentally, and part of the same research found that, a generation ago, when the same group was asked about what were the coolest brands, there was BMW and a Porsche and whatever in the top 20 cool brands. Last year, no car manufacturers appeared in the top 20 cool brands amongst this research in the United States about youthful mobility. During the first Gulf War I, perhaps you all recall, all unnecessary, as it was called, all unnecessary business travel was banned, and it had no effect on the world economy whatsoever. I actually take issue with Charles about why do global executives travel. I know a few global executives, they travel because they like being in the Gulf Stream. It's nothing to do, absolutely nothing to do with meeting, with meeting the staff. Anybody who spent any time, and we all have, in an airport lounge, can sense, anybody's been there, it's 5:30 in the morning waiting for your flight to Frankfurt or Geneva, you can just look around, you can see, you just know how utterly nugatory the activity which is taking place is. Travel. You just look. No sensible outcome. Come from this. The idea of sending human beings in pressurized tubes weighing 150 tons at 37,000 feet in order to meet other people who've done the same thing and meet in an airless hotel, the perimeter of Frankfurt Airport. This is just the craziest, most insane idea. But meanwhile, the study, look at the leisure travel as well. Look at the doleful, miserable, harrowed, harassed faces you see at Gatwick, Southern Terminal, at 4 o'clock on a weekend morning. No one can imagine. Just like Strindberg said, anybody who's heard the screams of a newborn infant or heard the death rattle of a dying man, no one could imagine that the period in between was meant to be enjoyed. That's rather a negative view of life, I grant you. But anybody who's been to Gatwick at 4 o'clock in the morning, as I have all too frequently, no one could surely imagine that the cultural, human, economic, philosophical, intellectual, practical benefits come from this activity. Meanwhile, my own personal belief is that Crossrail is going to be at immense cost to the convenience, amenity and aesthetics of London, incalculable cost for the past 5 years. Crossrail will actually be completed at precisely the historical moment when people decide it's totally useless to commute. The idea of sending, 80 kilograms of blood, bone and fat, from Maidenhead to the city in a fast train, it's just ludicrous idea it is. Alas, I'm not a poet, but I've, for a long time, I had an opening line of a poem resonating in my head, and it goes something like this. It says, "The places I will never go," the list gets longer every day. I can hear this rhythm constantly repeating itself in my mind's ear, and it's absolutely clear. Travel is all about a bittersweet mixture of promise and disappointment, delight and dismay, and that's. In this sense, I agree with Charles. Of course, curiosity is a part of it, but I think that, as I said, the sensitive among us are beginning to realise that the dismay is becoming larger than the delight. Tourism is utterly destructive. I can think of no positive benefits which have arisen out of the development of tourism. In the 19th century, John Ruskin, who represented the voice of the Victorian Imperium in those fabulous Old Testament tomes, he sensed this. He wrote, Ruskin was mad, of course. Ruskin, like me, was once an art critic, and then he moved from art criticism to political economy, and then promptly went insane. Technically insane. I may be on the same path myself. I'll leave it to you to judge. But Ruskin was terribly concerned about the arrival of the new railway in the Lake District, and he wrote a response to there's a book called a protest against the extension of the railways in the Lake District was published in 1876. And in this, this inspired Ruskin to the most extraordinary rhetorical inventive. He spoke about he said the stupid herds of modern tourists, and he thought that these same stupid herds of modern tourists would make the Lake District descend into hellish ugliness. I mean, this innocent railway, by the way, was just we all just by the by we all now regard it as a picturesque delight. Was intended to run from Windermere to Keswick. Ruskin saw it instead, and these words are marvellous here, as an enterprise conceived in a frenzy of avarice. His favourite landscapes are going to be blasted into a treeless waste of ashes, he said. Sheep will be driven from Helvellyn. All of Wales and Cumberland will be blown into a heap of slate and shingle. And all this simply to find. Anyway, that's by the by. What he actually said was ultimately was this, and this is often quoted about Ruskin on the railways. He said, what the new railway has to do is to shovel those who have come to Keswick to Windermere, and to shovel those who have come to Windermere back to Keswick. I'm afraid it was a ludicrous process which he identified then. Florence today is troubled by what the Florentine authorities call the maleducati, the poorly educated. That's a quite polite way of saying low-value tourism, and of course low-value tourism is another way of saying poor people. But what it is, I mean, sensitive visitors to Florence are now. We're Stendhal, the great travel writer Stendhal, who coined the word tourist. I mean, he wrote about his the glorious palpitations he felt when confronting great beauty in Florence, and he wrote about it so eloquently. In an Italian psychologist 20-30 years ago took it up and described Stendhal's syndrome, that sort of extraordinary frisson of pleasure you get when you see a great building. But nowadays you go to Florence and does anybody? I mean, you see the ludicrous, destructive acts of tourism. People smearing ketchup and burger grease over the Casa Buonarroti. I mean, I'm a broad-minded, fundamentally liberal, it's not my libertarian hedonist thing. A person keen on education, and I'm passionate about architecture and the inspiration which art can speak. But no one who's been to Florence can possibly construe that any benefit comes from either to Florence itself as a city, or to the majority of visitors there. They say that travel broadens the mind. But I personally have a conviction that actually the opposite is true. As they say in Zen, whatever is true, the opposite is truer. I rather think that travel narrows the mind. It certainly does in my case. I mean, the more places I go to, the fewer I want to return to. And I'm on the whole more interested, just a poem. I promised you there are no facts or science in what I'm saying. I'm just giving you a succession of beliefs and opinions. I'm personally much more interested in editing what I already know than adding more to my library. In particular, I was brought up with aeroplanes. My father used to work in the aircraft industry, and I was brought up a little bit with the romance of aeroplanes. I used to get, when I should have been doing something wholesome like playing football or drinking beer at weekends, I was hoiked around aircraft factories looking at machine tools and aircraft bits and pieces, which is part of what inspired my interest in design. I mean, I'm obsessively interested in aeroplanes. I love them as objects. But the fact is that through mass travel, low-cost travel particularly, has completely drained the romance of flight of all its enchantment. I mean, I don't think there's any human activity apart from being in a hospital or a prison which is more demeaning and more unpleasant than actually going to an airport. And if anybody disagrees, does anybody disagree? No. I mean, the jet plane, like Henry Ford's gasoline buggy, the jet plane promised to democratize travel, democratize luxury. That, in principle, is a good thing. But what it has done instead is universalize mediocrity. It spread the jet plane, universal jet travel hasn't made the world a better place. It's actually spread suburbanism across the planet. Noel Coward, marvellously, was once asked about a flight he'd just had. And how was your flight, Sir Noel, somebody once said. And Noel Coward magnificently said, well, aeronautically speaking, it was a great success. But socially, it left quite a lot to be desired. Anyway, Yeah, but my feeling about flying and the dangers of flying, never mind questions like frontier integrity. And I think there should be competitive tests and examinations for people moving from border to border. People should be tested for their decorum and taste before they're allowed to enter a foreign country. And I really mean it. I always think people should have at least PhD qualifications for entering central London as well, but that's a controversial idea. Anyway, the point about all transport systems, and Charles hinted at this before, and I think he's absolutely right. I mean, I love cars and planes and trains. I actually love the machinery, and I love the idea of the romance. All transport systems are magnificent because they combine at the same time the humankind's absolute genius and its utter folly. They're all there. They're all there. I mean, the human imagination is completely larded, with absurdity. We have fantastic machinery used for the most utterly banal purposes. I mean, ask any traffic jam out there. I mean, you have the more sophisticated. The motor industry is getting more and more sophisticated, Yet cars are getting less and less useful. Stand in any street corner in a provincial town and watch the morose faces of the people travelling past, and past the stoplights. What strange, melancholic vistas of escape are they contemplating? And the answer is, I don't know. All recreational travel is founded, right? Charles called it curiosity, but it's founded in the belief that authentic gratification of some sort, whether it's getting a tan, getting laid, getting seriously drunk, or whatever it is, or having extra pina coladas. Recreational travel is based on the idea that true, authentic gratification exists somewhere else. Travel is about desire. And desire is I'm trying to write a little book about desire at the moment, so this is the thing on my mind. Desire is not the same as lust. Lust is easily dealt with. It's spontaneous, and it's a spasm, and it's comes and goes. Desire is more complicated because it's about longings and yearnings played out over time. Now, travel is like that, but it's also absurd. And business travel is, in a sense, exactly the same as recreational travel because it's based on a similar unreliable delusion that suggests that that true prosperity can only be attained by activities elsewhere and not at home. Desire, however, I don't abjure all this. I don't reject all this. Desire has been actually at the core of the design of motor vehicles. As I said, the motor vehicle, the car, which is still obviously the most familiar transport system we all know. Its very origins, back to Henry Ford and his gasoline buggy, and removing us from boredom. It's always been about vistas of escape. After Henry Ford, there was a wonderful man in Detroit called Harley Earl, who just after Henry Ford had satisfied everybody's, by about 1926, everybody in the United States who could afford a car had bought a Model T Ford. Everybody had one. Desire was satisfied. The market was over. Then this extraordinary, and by the way, the idea, the wonderful thing I can't help passing on to an audience like this is that thing which they said of Henry Ford's famous thing, any colour as long as it's black. This was not aesthetic proscription by Henry Ford. It was something altogether different. Ford was so obsessed with economy and efficiency. In those days, they used to put the cars which had just been painted out in the sun to dry. And black paint dried much more quickly than any other colour. So Model T Fords were always black because they could shift them more quickly because the paint dried more quickly. Anyway, 1926, all Americans who could afford it were mobile with Model T Ford. Then a man called Harley Earl came along and he was a neighbour of Cecil B. DeMille in Hollywood. Harley Earl founded General Motors' Art and Colour section, as it was called. Later it became the styling division. And in 1926, Harley Earl had this absolute revelation, which defines the whole design idea of the 20th century. He said, if you added colour and interest to a car, maybe you could excite demand and curiosity. And that's what Harley Earl did. 1927, the whole idea of car styling began. And what Harley Earl said, when you get in a car, you should feel as though you're going on vacation for a while. And all that magnificent fantasy which Harley Earl was responsible for, those amazing American cars of the 1950s, they're all about that. They're all about going on holiday. They're all about exciting the idea of travel. Never mind anybody who's driven a American car of the 50s knows that they're abominable, insanitary death traps. But psychologically, they were magnificent because he captured that idea about movement. Transport, a motor car should transport you in mind as well as body, or so the theory went. It's a quaint, of course, but dated idea. But it also explains why, I mean, this year's latest transport fashion nonsense, Google's driverless car. It explains why Google's driverless car will never work, because for as long as people want cars, they actually want to drive them. They want to be engaged in the curious, idiosyncratic idea of having sort of literally intercourse with the machine. I mean, driving a car. One part of, I believe, of why we still enjoy, in a way, driving cars, because it allows all of us a total engagement with that primary 20th century experience, the modernist experience of grappling with the machine. But be that as it may, the idea that Google's driverless car represents some sort of transport option for the future strikes me as absolutely ludicrous. I mean, the flawlessness of a Google electronic pod, it just promises to encapsulate boredom. I mean, it's like alcohol-free lager. I mean, the cars are absurd, but they're fun because they're absurd. The economist John Maynard Keynes predicted that at about this moment now, the moment we're all sitting in, we would all be so prosperous that it would be the end of work. We'd be stopped working about now because we'd all have so much wealth we didn't need to generate any more. And as I said, Keynes was clearly wrong, and I'm probably wrong too, but just as Keynes was predicting the end of work, I am predicting any minute now the end of travel. If you actually have a well-organised life, leaving home for a completely disenchanted airport, or to sit in a traffic jam, or a characterless, driverless car, if you have a well-organised life, doing such a thing isn't an invitation to glorious intellectual, cultural curiosity. It means a dramatic reduction in your standard of living. I mean, it was once that fortunate, privileged people travelled continuously. Now, as anybody's been to an airport or a railway station or a port anywhere in the world, knows it's actually only the dispossessed who travel continuously. Equally, like Freakonomics, rich people were once fat, rich people are now thin. Rich people, the travellers know, rich people used to travel with a lot of luggage. Now it's only poor people who travel with a lot of luggage. Why is it always me who finds in front of him somebody trying to take a fridge freezer on board in an airport check-in? The amount of baggage carried through an airport is an inverse indicator of prosperity, I always find. And I think, my fundamental belief, and I come to my conclusion, I'd be glad to say, the more sophisticated you are nowadays, the less you move about. I mentioned Noel Coward before, but Noel Coward had this wonderful refrain in one of his songs. Why do the wrong people travel when the right people stay back at home? Anyway, so in future you know where I'm going to be.
No, you can't. You're coming to the front.
Oh,
yeah. Because now this is audience participation time. You have the speakers. Alan, you're not mic'd, are you? Maybe we could lend you a microphone if you would join us here. Yeah, I do. You're in loco, Roger. And here's your opportunity. You've offended most of the people in the room, Stephen. For you to...
Well, it wasn't my purpose, but it was a great opportunity.
Please. Introduce yourself.
Okay, I'm Kamal Panchal from the Local Government Association, but my sort of observations are not about coming from a local government perspective, but really about, 3 points really. I think the first one was the professor saying that education was dumbed down, but I've got 12-year-old and 8-year-old boys, and to be honest, the questions they ask me, they're certainly not dumbed down. And I remember back when I was that age, and they asked me, I would never have asked those sorts of questions that they do ask me now. So I do think that that's a bit disingenuous in terms of education these days. And the other point was, Stephen's point around travel, and almost like who has a right to travel. I mean, that's so snobbish, isn't it? I mean, people travel because they can travel, yeah? And they're allowed to travel, and they're allowed to go and see things, and they're allowed to decide what they think about those places and come back and then form an opinion. They may go and visit Paris and so on, look at the Eiffel Tower and whatever, and form an opinion. But actually, it's disingenuous to think that that's all they've taken back is to see a site and go back and comment on it or post a picture of it on Facebook or so on. People actually think and evaluate these places a lot more than you perhaps give credit for. A lot of people visit India. I visit India regularly, and I actually think people do take a lot back than what you think.
Come to your conclusion, yeah.
My point is that it's a bit disingenuous what has been said tonight. I think people take a lot back from travelling than what has been perhaps reported back. And the final point is that why people travel. People travel. I mean, I commute from Peterborough to Westminster every day, and part of it, I do that. I've been doing it for 14 years. Is that there's a lot of me time in there, and I really value that. And I think that's probably
That's
another
exactly
reason
the point, if I can draw you to a conclusion, because you're making the point that we're trying to draw out. You travel from Peterborough to London, not because it's necessarily cheaper to live in Peterborough, I don't know, I'm now not...
It is.
Well, yes, it is cheaper to live in Peterborough, but because you have chosen to position your life so that you make space for me time. Yeah. Now, that doesn't necessarily normally get reflected in the way in which people in this room think day to day about travel. And I think that's exactly, if you don't mind me saying so, the point, your final one, that we're really trying to bring out today. But in terms of education being dumbed down, Charles...
I'm very concerned about your 8 and 12-year-old boys. Did you say you don't like them asking questions?
No, sorry,
No.
exactly the opposite. I like them asking questions, but I'm saying I'm amazed that I'm comparing and contrasting the questions they ask me now compared to the questions I asked at similar age. I never asked those questions because I never had that base amount of knowledge. They have a much
I think it's a
higher
general point about
base amount of
education
knowledge.
rather than the specific on travel. Stephen, do you want to answer the
Well,
second?
no, I got lots of. I've
whether
got a
curiosity
huge
should be
catalogue of
honoured.
opinions about educational standards. But is that what we?
No, I think the question was, people travel by curiosity, and I think the argument made was you were being a bit
Elitist.
descriptive and elitist about whether... I thought your answer would be, if I can answer for you...
Do.
That we've got many other ways of these days satisfying curiosity, and it's something maybe now a bit more than just curiosity. You can go onto the internet and find out a lot about.
Yes.
You'll probably find out more quickly if it's really curiosity.
There are a
about
lot of
Florence.
questions bundled up here. I mean, first of all, I'm not against. Elitism, provided it's I think you can be democratic and elitist at the same time. Elitism seems to me just to acknowledge the idea of the best, and I think the best should be universally available. But I think you should have to. But for me, you need to make an effort to experience the best. This is one of my objections to low cost air travel. It's not. I have no objection to people going and getting enlightening themselves and having glorious experiences. I'm against them doing it at an uneconomic cost, and at an unrealistic cost, and at using transport systems which tend to destroy the destinations. I mean, it's not. I spent travel as much as most people. I mean, there was a lot of what I was saying was meant to be polemical and ironical and sardonic. Of course, I don't necessarily believe it all, but I think yes, of course, people travel is inspiration. I just think people are best rewarded when they've made a little effort to do things.
Can I ask the assembled company? Is there anybody here who believes Stephen's final point, which was that we're on the cusp of an inversion in what we've seen for the whole of my life, really ever since Whittle invented the jet engine, possibly, which is a continuous explosion in travel, and we're about to see an inversion where travel for the sake of travel, not necessarily just to get to A to B, the lust for travel will change? Or the desire, it was desire, not lust, desire for travel. Sorry, the gentleman in the back wanted to answer that point first, I think.
Peter Quinn from King's College. I think that I agree with the concept that travel for pleasure is being eroded by the concept of the masses and the pleasure of satisfying one's curiosity is being diluted as a consequence.
Right. Anton, did you want to say something?
Tom Valk, I think it's changing in the sense that the younger generation, my children, are trying to avoid traveling because they like to work from home. So in my time, I worked 5 days a week. My daughter works 5 days a week, but she works 2 days at home.
What about holidays?
Sorry?
Holidays?
No, for work. I mean, because work and travel are also together. And you said very correctly that curiosity is one of the, and I like that very much, that when you go to somewhere and you meet people, it's also satisfying curiosity. I think that's...
But how does she satisfy herself? I would personally have some sympathy with Charles's view that there is something in our human interaction that requires us to see each other, which a video at this stage at any rate, or a hologram can't replicate. How does she satisfy that in her working environment?
Well, because she does that with a lot of people who live in her neighborhood, so that's one thing. And on work, she still does it, but only for 3 days a week. And if you do it less than 5 days a week, if you would do that in London, and going back to transport policy, it would change your whole way of home-work situation. I mean, it would change that dramatically.
The gentleman in the blue shirt who has been trying for some time.
Thank you. Glenn Lyons, UWE. If I may say so, Stephen, I found your talk delightfully offensive, if that's the right phrase.
Thank you.
I believe the future is uncertain, and I would defy anyone to forecast it for me and come back and say they were right. What I do believe is that we are in the midst, perhaps a third of the way through, a fundamental transition in society. The challenge is that that transition is slow. It's taken 20 or 30 years already, just as the transition from horse-drawn to the fully blown motorised age took 60, 70 to 100 years, as did sailing ships to steamships. These things happen gradually. And I think too many of us in this room were born of the motor age. Our children are children of the transition. They're the ones who are living life through a screen. They're seeing things that we simply can't see. And this isn't, I'm not quite sure I go as far as to say the death of travel, but I think we have moved into an increasingly banal existence of travel, and yet we carry still the delusions of past expectations of achievement and social norms. And I think those have adjusted now, so that there's increasingly less appetite for travel as we've known it. I think in particular that the car will become a background technology rather than the foreground passion that we've seen for the last few decades.
I mean, it's arguable, I would have thought, that fundamentally we as human beings haven't changed. I mean, that, the evolutionary pattern that Charles talked about was achieved over many thousands of years. I recommend frequently and rather monotonously to people the book called The Shallow, I can't even remember the name of the author, which is about how our brains are changed by the internet. Most of those people at the ITC have read it because I've distributed it for free. But how our brains are being changed by the internet and continual interruption. I think it's entirely possible, personally, that our attitude towards travel and the enthusiasm we have for travel as in just movement might be slightly different because we are getting different stimuli and our brains are therefore forming slightly more differently. But
most of our brains are shaped by what happened in the Neolithic, in the Stone Age. We are essentially evolved still from that, because the time since then has been so short, it hasn't actually been enough time to change us. And if you take the last 2,500 years, we are no cleverer than the Greeks of Plato and...
Well, I don't know how you would measure that.
Cleverness?
Yeah, but I think there's your early, what you earlier said. There's obviously the prehistoric schema which you so eloquently described about hominids leaving Africa. But I think the idea of recreational and business travel is a very historically specific thing, which begins in the 17th, 18th European century, and I believe is coming to an end now, or at least is coming to a moment when we radically revise our assumptions about it.
It's Christian Walmart. I'm afraid that I don't think that Professor Pasternak managed to persuade me. When you look at patterns of travel, first of all, you look at the 19th century, people lived in the same village forever. It wasn't until they got the train and the bicycle that actually they started to, there was no curiosity about that. They couldn't, you know.
So they travelled to work.
They only went occasionally to the next village, maybe if they married the girl from the next town. But
no,
that was about it.
I did say the basic reasons that the travel that we share with animals.
But I was just
finding a
that's
mate.
the point I'd like to make. I don't think you made at all the case for saying that we travel for no purpose. We travel. I think the Great Migrations were probably about food or hunting animals. We travel to go to work. We travel to go see places, which, yes, that's partly curiosity, but it's partly just to get sun or see or whatever. You made no case at all for your basic tenet, which was that we travel because we're curious. I don't think you managed to differentiate ourselves there from, you know, my dog, who, when I walk the dog, kind of sniffs at kind of every corner because she is curious. And I don't think you managed to kind of make the point that we travel because we're curious.
Well, I think, yeah, absolutely. Anybody who's been in Prague recently on a Friday night knows that most of the people in Prague on a Friday night are not travelling out of curiosity. They're travelling out of the incentive being cheap beer. It's not, you know, it's... No one can persuade. I don't want to sound obsessive about low-cost air travel, but I am. I mean, no one can persuade me that what's happened to, say, Prague in the past 15 years has been a benefit to anybody.
I'll come back to John Pollack, but I just need somebody from the aviation industry sitting in that general corner to defend air travel. I think this is slightly off-piece, but Dale.
I'm Dale Keller from the Board of Airline Representatives, so we represent 71 airlines in the UK. But, you know, these are pretty much my personal views as well. It's not just on terms of an association, but we've seen a cycle for sure. We've seen a flattening of aviation demand through the recessionary period we've been through. But if you look at the aircraft orders, you know, going forward, we're seeing some strong growth projected as these new aircraft fleets come in. And environmentally, what you're going to see is the airline industry growing into that capacity in an environmental way. So what we're going to see is the noise footprint and the carbon emission per passenger will come down. So we're not going to see massive reductions in carbon emissions across the globe, but what we're going to see is that the growth can continue within what we've really got today. And I think there's a lot of other opportunity for decarbonising on the ground because, you know, ultimately an aircraft at 37,000 feet is the most difficult thing to decarbonise, but, you know, electrifying ground fleets and all these things. And I think that we'll still see that demand for travel, but, you know, democratically, I think, you know, all the points everyone's made are correct in their own way. And I think it's a whole balance of all of those things, you know, that the internet and Skype have not been the death knell of international air travel. And I think that supports that.
Can I make a point regarding decarbonisation? There is a team at the Culham, where I have my office, that is working on non-fuel-based travel, rather like rockets, hydrogen and oxygen, but in a way that you don't shoot up and then have to come down by parachute, but you can actually take off and land. And one of the key things about that is that they are developing the idea of, because liquefied hydrogen and liquefied oxygen, especially liquefied oxygen, is very heavy to take up, that's the trouble with the rockets, of using the oxygen in the air, so they only have to take up a little bit to fire the thing off, and they take up liquefied hydrogen, and then they use the oxygen in the air, and a prototype they're working on, I don't know when it'll be, but all it will produce is water. Well, I wouldn't say 3 or 4 generations.
But isn't one of the objections though about, as I just hinted about, we can make the new generation of the 737 MAX, the A320neo, and the rest of they're going to be much cleaner, more efficient. But it's not. I mean, that's welcome, of course. But there is no amount of improving the efficiency of the oil-burning jet engine is going to remove the fact that aeroplanes cause condensation, create artificial clouds, which now certain evidence pointing to has a contribution to warming.
Thank you. I want to make 3 points briefly. First is
could it be one?
I think we need to guard against the temptation to think that we live in an era of transformation. It's the conceit of every age to believe that that is true. Occasionally it's true, but mostly it's not. I think the second point is that one of the messages, it seems to me, that's come out of the presentations this evening, that's a very strong one and that we can all take away and use practically, and we have the means to use practically, is the idea that the time we spend traveling has a value inherently that is distinct from the value associated with the thing we do when we get to the other end. Recognizing that analytically and economically is rather straightforward. We just tend not to do it. The third point, with apologies to Stephen, is an attempt to rescue the idea of libertarianism from the slap-about treatment earlier. We travel because it is an expression of liberty. Aristotle was quoted earlier. I shall quote Plato. To know is to be free. We are curious because we wish to know, and we wish to know because we wish to be free. And one of the things that troubles me most profoundly about the current policy debates, and those which have pertained for the past few decades, is the attempt to pathologize transport and movement, because it seems to me that's an attempt to pathologize liberty. And we do that at our peril. Thank you.
Oh. I'm going to ask Rod.
Rod Smith.
I'm going to have two more, then we must let Philip draw this to a
I think there's an
conclusion.
element here of not really taking into account what I might call contentment or happiness. I'm reminded of my grandmother, who was truly a Victorian creation, who'd never seen the sea, who never climbed the hill at the back of the house because she didn't see the point of it, but lived an extremely contented and happy life. And I compare that with my life, rushing across the globe, booking air flights to Tokyo at the drop of a hat and so on and so. Is my life any happier? I'm just coming to the conclusion it's not. And I think this element of contentedness and happiness is very important in people's psyche, and more people are realising that it's not necessarily satisfied by travel.
Yeah, well, you and Stephen, by the sounds of it, agree. Lady next to you.
Thank you. Anne Fry, independent consultant. I wanted to come back to the point about curiosity as the driver for travel, and the fact that young people are travelling much less, they're much less likely to get driver licenses and so on. And just wondering where that's taking us in the future. Fascinating bit of research from Montreal, which shows that since young people no longer travel across the city to meet up, but they communicate by social media, teenage pregnancy rates have plummeted. So some interesting consequences. But what is it telling us? Has curiosity gone from the younger generation?
I personally, if you're asking me, clearly it hasn't gone. It just finds more sophisticated, means of gratification than sort of hauling your carcass across a city or across a continent or across the planet.
Final question.
Peter Borman, independent consultant. Yeah, I think the interesting question is how much travel do we need to satisfy our curiosity? And I think some of the changes that are occurring is that we are not so interested in habitual travel every day. Thus, the interest in working from home, I think, has increased from 500,000 right up to 4.5 million at the moment over the last 30 years. I think also everyone recognises the changes in retail, where the desire to go supermarket shopping every week is certainly not of interest to people in their 30s. So retail shopping has decreased. So I think the technology is allowing us to be more selective. And so I would hope that the journeys we make are more orientated towards curiosity out of rather than necessity. And the last thing to observe in terms of change is if you study the changes in transport since 1970, it's far more about what goes on whilst you're travelling. Look at the media in the car, the media in the train, the mobile devices, to their annoyance to some people. So in other words, it's fully recognised in the industry. It's not the movement that's changing. but the enabling of doing different things whilst travelling. So there's a few points there.
Thank you very much. Before we ask Philip, who is the Permanent Secretary of the Department for Transport, to conclude, and has the job, therefore, of turning all this thought or points into a transport strategy and plan for our country, maybe I could ask each of the speakers in no more than a minute to respond with points that they wish they'd had a chance to make as a result of this dialogue. Maybe in reverse order. Stephen first.
Oh my God, I wasn't.
1 minute only.
I wasn't prepared.
You don't have to stand up.
I wasn't prepared for for that. Everything I said shouldn't be. As I said, as I say, the Zen saying, whatever is true, the opposite is true. Of course we know. Of course we travel. I personally travel a lot. I just think we are coming to the end of that historical moment when recreational and business travel is a dominant part of life. There are other ways of satisfying our curiosity now, and I also think people need to exit as far as low-cost air travel is concerned. I passionately believe people need to exercise a certain amount of self-restraint and need to pay an economic price for the experience they're having.
Charles.
To try and encourage youngsters to travel more and not to sit at home and playing games on their computer, I think would be something very well worthwhile. I think that generally getting out and about is far more educationally desirable than sitting at home watching the television.
Well, I think there are other options, aren't there, from watching television?
For example,
you could stay at home and
stay at home and write an opera,
and write a book or do some cooking or
yes.
design an orrery.
Few of them
you don't have to.
You
don't have to watch television. I think some of my heroes used to spend Montaigne, Voltaire. I mean, had a very they had a jolly good time sitting at home, looking after themselves. I don't think their curiosity was inhibited by either just living in their tower or their garden.
Alan, you design things for travel, and you know how to satisfy people's travel or the environment for travel.
I think for the ITC, this study that we've embarked on is an enormously interesting subject, and it's very, very interesting to hear the complete divergence of views, because I imagine that many of us here tonight have never really discussed it very fully. So I think it's great, but there's one point, and I very much look forward to discussing it more particularly with Charles, is I sense there's something about a change in our collective intelligence, which comes from this amazing electronic revolution we're going through, but also needs the meeting up face to face. And I sense that might well be a very interesting driver for our economic and cultural future too, that collective intelligence becoming this combination of the billions of neurons in each of our brains with each other.
Thank you. Look, before I invite Philip to conclude, because that will be the final moment, may I make a few votes of thanks. First of all, to all of our three speakers for the contribution they've made, not always consistently with each other, sometimes not even consistently within each speech necessarily, but thank them very much for an entertaining and a thought-provoking, I hope you'll find, discussion, which has been true to what it was intended to be, which has taken us out of the A to B, the derived demand, into what is the fundamental motivation. So would you thank all of them? Thank you very much. I would also just like to thank particularly the people who've made this possible, not just the people within the ITC, Brighton, Lucy, and people who are here today, or the commissioners who put an awful lot of effort into other things and projects that work, but also to my colleagues. Rothschild is a slightly unusual organisation, and today is our summer party, announced only 2 weeks before the summer party, and it's the first in 8 years, and so they're foregoing the prospect of going into the Tower of London for a summer party to look after you tonight. So thank you very much for that. And finally, Philip, who is not Mary Cray, who was intended to take on this role, but she decided at the last minute she didn't want to. And Philip, therefore, thank you particularly for standing in. The only similarity between Philip and Mary Cray, as far as I'm aware, is that you both cycle. But I've known Philip an awful long time, and I know him as a as obviously out of the Treasury originally, but a keen transport enthusiast, not just by virtue of his current responsibility. A cyclist, as I said, interested in the structure of the railway from way back where we first met. Philip, how on earth are you going to put all this together?
How on earth, Simon? Indeed, you didn't quite warn me. But let me have a go.
You wouldn't have taken it on if I'd warned you.
No. I come from the utilitarian end of this business. I come from, indeed, having discussed derived demand only today, spending my time looking at port statistics. Can we regionalise them? Thinking about investment projects. And I kid you not, yesterday evening's discussion for me was about the weight of agricultural trailers. So, against that utilitarian background, and much of transport, to make sense of it, is about how we resolve those issues big and small and in between, in a way that's timely, meets people's needs, allows people to go on flights to Prague when they want to, meets all sorts of social needs. Against that background, I have to say it has been a delight to hear about some other rather more fundamental aspects of human travel. There's been quite a lot of contention, quite a lot of debate, but actually I think there's some things underlying all of this are quite held in common. So we heard about travel as a response to human curiosity. We heard about it as a response to human desire. Perhaps those two are not very far apart. And underneath it all, I think we heard a lot about travel and as an aesthetic experience, the sensory aspect of travel. And it may be that the value of that sensation goes up and down as more and more stag parties go to Prague. Fewer, perhaps, spend their time elsewhere. The value of the aesthetic value, the sensory value of different experiences can change over time, just as the financial and monetary value can change. But that we should think about the aesthetic experience, the human satisfaction to be derived from the aesthetics of travel, strikes me as a very, very pertinent and central point for policymakers, for strategists, as well as for aesthetes and practitioners of every kind. So that point about the aesthetics of travel, the sensation of travel. And I say all that I've got three experiences came to my mind as I was listening to the contributions, which allows me, I think, in some respect, to agree with each of the speakers. I'll be going home on my bike, reflecting the value of living not so far from work, the pleasant sensation of cycling through the city on a summer evening. I share some of your feelings, Stephen, about airports, at least at 5 o'clock in the morning, when I will be taking my eldest child to a well-known airport in order for her to get a flight, a long distance. I have accepted that this is the father's duty. So that's some of the downsides of travel. But she'll have a great time. She will be taking advantage of everything you've said, Charles, about going out and exploring the world. She feels none of these reservations. She is there to explore and learn. And yes, I fear ultimately she will feel some sense of disappointment. But let's postpone that for at least a few years. And then the third moment that came in my mind in my near future is when I take another child this is, again, not so much the father's duty, but the father's calling, to walk with me across Wales, north to south. Now, she may find that, so far she's managed to express some enthusiasm, but that is, if you like, another aspect of the aesthetics of travel. And okay, it's not on a par with Ibn Battuta or Marco Polo, but still, it should be good fun. And fun is one word I want to add to this. So, I just want to say, you've already said thank you, Simon, but I was told to do the vote of thanks, so I'm going to do a thanks again. I'm going to thank Charles for making the emotional aspects, the sensory aspects of travel, giving them a logical basis, a very rational basis, which we can all grasp. I want to thank Stephen for being particularly provoking and for quoting Ruskin and for making the first use of the word orrery in a transport lecture that I have heard and that I think I ever will hear. So I want to thank all the speakers, and I want to thank the ITC for convening such a thought-provoking and aesthetically satisfying debate. Thank you.